Welcome to Royal History UK, where the past comes alive.
Okay, so your country just declared war in 1914. You've got the soldiers, you've got the generals, you've got the flags and the speeches and the crowds cheering in the streets. Everyone expects it to be over by Christmas. Clean, fast, decisive. A short, sharp shock to remind the other side who's in charge. Here's what nobody told you. The bill for that confidence is going to arrive long after the soldiers come home, and some countries will still be paying it when the next war starts. World War I did not end in 1918, not economically. It ended in collapsed currencies, bankrupt empires, unpayable debts, and the precise financial conditions that made everything that came after it inevitable. The guns stopped, the ledgers did not. So before we talk about trenches and generals, we need to talk about the one question history books almost never answer cleanly. How much did it actually cost to fight the first industrial war in human history? The answer will change how you understand every political crisis of the 20th century. Before 1914, Europe was experiencing something that looked a lot like the world we live in now. Open borders for capital, international investment on a massive scale, trade flowing freely between nations that were, at least on paper, deeply economically intertwined. London sat at the center of all of it. The Bank of England and the classical gold standard anchored the entire international monetary system. Exchange rates were fixed by the gold content of each national currency, creating a stable, predictable global clearing system. By the early 20th century, approximately 406,000 kilometers of submarine telegraph cables crossed the world's oceans, with the North Atlantic connection alone processing around 10,000 messages daily. Markets from New York to Bombay to Berlin were, for the first time in history, genuinely integrated. And here's the thing about deeply integrated economies. They're supposed to be self-protecting. That was the argument British journalist Norman Angell made it famous in his 1909 bestseller, The Great Illusion. His thesis was direct: modern wealth consists of intangible assets, credit networks, contracts, commercial relationships, not physical territory you can seize at gunpoint. If one industrialized nation invaded another, the financial disruption alone would damage the aggressor as severely as the victim. The Economist agreed. War between industrial powers wasn't just immoral. It was economically suicidal. It was completely wrong. But it seemed bulletproof at the time. Beneath the surface of that integrated, peaceful-looking Europe, something else was happening. Industrial production had grown so large that domestic markets couldn't absorb it. Nations needed raw materials from the outside and export markets beyond their borders. That need turned into colonial competition, which turned into state-level rivalry, which turned into something that looked a lot more like a slow-motion arms race than a globalized peace. The clearest fault line ran between Great Britain and Germany. After German unification in 1871, German industrialization accelerated at a pace that alarmed everyone else. By the early 20th century, German steel and chemical output surpassed that of Great Britain, France, Russia, and Italy combined. All of them. Combined, that kind of economic surge doesn't stay quiet, it produces political ambition. Germany wanted its own global empire, its own maritime reach, its own place among the great powers. Britain, which had built the world's largest empire on the assumption it would remain the dominant industrial and naval force, watched this very carefully. The response was a naval arms race. When the Royal Navy launched HMS Dreadnought in 1906, a turbine-powered, all-big-gun battleship that made every existing capital ship obsolete overnight, it triggered a construction competition that neither side could afford to lose. Between 1909 and 1914, Britain launched 19 dreadnoughts and 9 battlecruisers. Germany countered with 13 dreadnoughts and 5 battlecruisers. Britain's annual naval expenditure climbed from £31.5 million to £50 million. That's the hidden pre-war story. The tension wasn't manufactured. It was structural. And it was funded by the taxpayers of both nations years before a single shot was fired. The decade before the war was a masterclass in competitive military spending. Every major European power was running a parallel program: expand the army, modernize the equipment, stockpile the reserves, and do it all without triggering a domestic financial crisis. The numbers tell the story better than any diplomatic memo. Russia, still rebuilding after its humiliating defeat by Japan in 1905, was spending 4.5% of its gross domestic product on defense between 1910 and 1913. Germany directed 54% of its entire federal budget toward the military, the highest share of any major power, driven partly by the fact that Berlin had limited access to direct income taxes, which were reserved for individual German states. France spent 3.7% of GDP. Britain 3.2%. Meanwhile, the United States was spending less than 1% of its GDP on defense. Less than 1%. The Americans were watching from a continent away, largely insulated from the pressure building across the Atlantic. By the summer of 1914, the six major powers had spent a combined total that, in today's terms, runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars, just on peacetime preparation. The war hadn't started. The bill was already running. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, took only seconds to execute. What happened next took decades to unwind. As diplomatic tensions escalated through the July crisis, the financial markets of the world began to understand something the generals hadn't announced yet. The deeply integrated global credit system, the one that was supposed to make war impossible, was about to become a transmission mechanism for economic catastrophe. The panic started with liquidity. British commercial banks began calling in international loans. Capital flooded back toward London as investors converted foreign assets to gold. The pound surged. Exchange rates broke through the gold export point. In the United States, European investors dumped American stocks and bonds in a desperate bid to repatriate cash, threatening to drain U.S. gold reserves and potentially force the country off the gold standard entirely. Within days of mobilization orders, international trade slowed to a standstill. The clearing systems that connected global markets seized up. The very sophistication that had made the pre-war economy so productive, the credit chains, the interlocked financial relationships, the cross-border investment, now made the transmission of panic instantaneous. Norman Angell had been right that a war would cause economic disaster. He had just assumed that insight would prevent the war. It didn't. Within a week of the July crisis, the financial consequences moved from theoretical to physical. July 23rd, Austria-Hungary delivers its ultimatum to Serbia. Markets shift from confidence to fear in real time. July 25th through 30th, Vienna, Berlin, Paris, and Rome suspend or severely restrict trading on their stock exchanges. July 31st, the London Stock Exchange closes its doors for the first time in its history. It stays shut for 5 months, July 31st, same day, U.S. Treasury Secretary William Gibbs McAdoo orders the closure of the New York Stock Exchange to halt European dumping of American securities. It stays closed for 4 months, August 1st. Virtually every major stock market in the world has shut down. Global financial liquidity is frozen. When the New York Stock Exchange finally reopened for restricted trading on December 12, 1914, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell 24.39% in a single session, from 71 to 54. Largest single-day percentage decline in the index's history at that point. Not because of a battle. Because of uncertainty about how long this was going to last and how much it was going to cost, to prevent bank runs, governments moved fast. Britain implemented the Currency and Banknotes Act on August 5th, suspending the gold standard and issuing unbacked paper treasury notes. The age of gold-backed stability was over. What came next was the age of creative accounting at a national scale. Here's where the math gets uncomfortable. By the autumn of 1914, everyone understood this was not going to be over by Christmas. The assumption of a short, self-financing war had collapsed, and that left every belligerent government staring at the same equation with no good answers. The formula is simple. Total war expenditure equals increased taxation, plus borrowing, plus money creation. 3 options. Pick your poison. Direct taxation was the most economically stable. Money comes in, you spend it, no debt accumulates, no inflation. But it was politically brutal and administratively slow. You can't build a new tax system fast enough to fund a war that started last Tuesday. Borrowing let governments push the cost into the future. Sell bonds, defer the reckoning. But that required deep capital markets, willing lenders, and, crucially, confidence that you were going to win and be able to repay. Printing money was the fastest option and the most dangerous. You create liquidity immediately, but every extra note in circulation is a quiet tax on everyone who holds the currency. Inflation doesn't insult itself. It just shows up in the price of bread. Every major belligerent used all 3. The mix they chose determined what their economies looked like 5, 10, 20 years after the armistice. The war forced a transformation in taxation that no parliament would have passed in peacetime. In Britain, the standard income tax rate was 5.8% in 1913. By 1918, it was 30%. The government also lowered exemption thresholds, adding 2.4 million new taxpayers to the system overnight. People who had never paid income tax in their lives were now funding artillery shells. Then came the excess profits duty, introduced in 1915. If your company was making more money than it did before the war, which many were, because governments were buying everything in sight, the state took 50% of that excess. By 1917, the rate was 80%. This single tax generated nearly 1/3 of total British government revenue during the war. Nearly 1/3. The United States came in late but moved fast. The War Revenue Act of 1917 raised the corporate tax rate from 1% to 12%, pushed the top individual surtax rate to 67%, and created a new excess profits tax on corporations ranging from 20 to 60%. They also invented Form 1099 to track non-wage payments, modern tax infrastructure, built under wartime pressure. Britain funded roughly 30% of its total war expenditure through taxation. The United States, entering later with a larger industrial base, funded 22% through tax revenues. The rest had to come from somewhere else. Because taxes couldn't close the gap, governments turned to their citizens not as taxpayers but as lenders. And to make that work at the scale required, they had to turn borrowing money into a patriotic act. In the United States, the Treasury Department organized 5 major drives: the Liberty Loans and the Victory Loan, raising over $14 billion from the general public. These were not quiet financial instruments. They were mass campaigns with celebrity endorsements, factory floor drives, school programs, and social pressure sophisticated enough to make refusing to buy a bond feel unpatriotic. Citizens bought at 75 cents on the dollar, with a 30 to 40-year maturity and roughly 4% annual return. Sounds reasonable, until you account for the inflation those same bond proceeds were about to create. The Federal Reserve made it easier through the Borrow and Buy program. Commercial banks extended low-interest loans specifically to fund bond purchases, and the Fed accepted those bonds as collateral. This monetized a portion of the public debt, easing credit conditions and fueling exactly the inflation that would erode the real return on those bonds. In Germany, the imperial government launched 9 separate national war loans, the Kriegsanleihen, raising over 100 billion marks. Citizens traded their private gold ornaments for iron metals and paper bonds, on the assumption that the debt would be repaid using reparations extracted from defeated allied nations. That assumption did not survive contact with reality. When borrowing wasn't enough, the printing presses ran. Germany provides the clearest case study in how that works and where it leads. Before the war, the Reichsbank was legally required to back at least 1/3 of all circulating paper notes with gold held in its vaults. Rigid rule, hard constraint. On August 4th, 1914, the Reichstag passed emergency banking laws that effectively bypassed it. The government authorized new state-run loan bureaus, Darlehenskassen, that extended credit using securities and physical goods as collateral and issued their own paper notes. Those notes were then counted as official reserves at the Reichsbank, which meant for every paper mark the loan bureaus printed without gold backing, the Reichsbank could legally print 3 more real marks on top of it. That's not money creation. That's a money creation machine. German paper mark circulation went from 6 billion marks in 1913 to over 33 billion by the end of 1918. Wholesale prices rose to 143 by 1918, 470 by 1919, and 1,501 by 1920. These numbers end in hyperinflation in 1923, when the mark becomes so worthless that workers are paid twice daily so they can spend their wages before the next price increase. It started here, in the emergency banking laws of August 1914. The catastrophe that destroyed Germany's middle class 20 years before Hitler used it as his central political argument was baked into the financing decisions of the first week of the war. By the end of 1914, it was clear that winning this war wasn't just a military problem. It was a production problem. Market mechanisms were replaced by government mandates, price controls, and direct state control of production. In Germany, Walther Rathenau persuaded the War Ministry in August 1914 to establish the War Raw Materials Department, the KRA, which ordered private warehouses to transfer essential material to military manufacturers at fixed prices. By 1916, Hindenburg and Ludendorff launched the Hindenburg Program, aiming to double munitions output and triple artillery and machine gun production. They extended compulsory national service to all males aged 17 to 60. In Britain, the trigger was the shell crisis of 1915, when the press exposed that British artillery on the Western Front was rationed 4 shells per gun per day. Parliament passed the Munitions of War Act, creating the Ministry of Munitions under David Lloyd George. Within a year, the ministry was the largest employer, purchaser, and seller in Britain, managing over 20,000 factories and controlling the supply of steel, wool, leather, and flax. The private economy didn't disappear. It was conscripted. Here's what total war production actually looked like in numbers. Britain established over 200 national projectile factories for standardized mass production of heavy caliber ammunition. To supply the propellant required, the government built HM Factory Gretna on the English-Scottish border, 9 miles long, employing 10,000 workers, producing 800 tons of cordite per week by 1917. Workers called the explosive mixture devil's porridge. The total wartime production figures across all major powers defy intuition. Great Britain produced over 200 million artillery shells between 1914 and 1918. Germany produced over 150 million. The United States, entering late in 1917, still managed 12 million. British small arms ammunition production exceeded 8 billion rounds. German production exceeded 9 billion. Every one of those shells required steel, copper, chemical propellant, skilled labor, transport, and machinery that had to be built, maintained, and operated around the clock. Factories ran 24 hours in rotating shifts. Railway networks were subordinated to munitions logistics. Entire industries were converted overnight, automotive plants making trucks, textile mills making uniforms, chemical plants making explosives. The cost of any single day of this machine running was larger than the annual military budgets of most pre-war nations. Industrial war revealed something that most military strategists had underweighted. Armies don't just fight, they eat. And if you can cut off an enemy's food supply, you don't need to beat them in the field. You just need to wait. The British Royal Navy implemented a naval blockade of Germany that designated food itself as contraband. Germany had produced approximately 80% of its own food in peacetime, but that production depended heavily on imported nitrogenous and phosphate fertilizers, which the blockade cut off entirely. At the same time, the military mobilized millions of farmers and most of Germany's draft horses, pulling labor and power out of agriculture at the moment agricultural productivity needed to rise. The result was the turnip winter of 1916 to 1917. The potato crop failed in an unusually wet autumn. Civilians survived on sweet turnips, livestock fodder, as their primary nutrition. Daily rations fell below 1,150 calories. Widespread malnutrition set in, followed by tuberculosis, rickets, and scurvy. The German Board of Public Health claimed in December 1918 that 763,000 civilians had died from starvation and blockade-related disease. Later academic studies revised the figure to between 424,000 and 478,000 excess civilian deaths between 1914 and 1919, excluding the Spanish flu pandemic. Nearly 1% of Germany's pre-war population of 67 million people, killed by economic policy, not artillery. When millions of working-age men disappeared into the trenches, someone had to run the factories. The answer was already there: underutilized and underpaid. In Britain, the Ministry of Munitions implemented a policy called dilution, negotiated with trade unions through the Treasury Agreement of March 1915. It broke down skilled engineering tasks into simpler, repeatable processes that could be performed by workers with less training, and it opened those positions to women. Female employment in British munitions factories grew from 200,000 in 1914 to over 700,000 by the war's end. They were called munitionettes. The work was dangerous in ways not fully understood at the time. Women handling trinitrotoluene (TNT) absorbed the chemical through their skin and lungs, turning their skin and hair a bright orange yellow, earning them the nickname Canary Girls. Prolonged exposure caused severe liver toxicity, with approximately 400 recorded cases and at least 72 deaths directly attributed to chemical poisoning. Factory explosions added to the toll. Barnbow in 1916 killed 35 women. Silvertown in 1917 killed 73 people. Chilwell in 1918 killed over 130 workers in a single event. Here's where the economic legacy cuts both ways. The scale of female participation genuinely shifted labor markets. But the shift was temporary by design. Under the Munitions of War Act, dilution was explicitly designated as a measure for the duration of the war. When the armistice came, women were displaced to make way for returning servicemen. Most were excluded from unemployment benefits unless they had worked before 1914. The structural change that looked permanent wasn't. When the war started in 1914, the United States was a net debtor nation. American institutions owed approximately $3 billion to European investors. 4 years later, the flow of capital had entirely reversed, and the United States had become the primary creditor of the entire Western world. Allied powers, primarily Britain and France, needed to buy food, raw materials, and industrial equipment from American suppliers. They had gold and foreign assets at first, but total war burns through gold reserves at speeds peacetime economists never modeled. As reserves ran down, the Allies needed credit. J.P. Morgan and Company was designated in 1915 as the sole purchasing agent in the United States for the British and French governments. J.P. Morgan then led a syndicate of American banks to float the $500 million Anglo-French loan. Private credit aligned with Allied survival. By 1917, private markets were approaching their capacity. The United States entered the war, and the U.S. Treasury began extending direct loans to Allied governments. By the armistice, the United States had lent over $10 billion, approaching $215 billion in today's terms. While every European power abandoned gold convertibility to finance the war, the US dollar remained anchored to gold. Traders worldwide shifted their transaction currency. New York replaced London as the world's financial capital. It was a transition that didn't require a single battle. It was executed entirely through balance sheets. Economist Ernest Bogart, in his 1920 study of the war's financial consequences, estimated the total direct costs of World War I at approximately $186 billion in 1913 values. Adjusted to 2026 dollars, that figure approaches $6.11 trillion. That's the bill for 4 years of fighting. Just the direct military expenditure. The British national debt grew from £706 million in 1914 to £7.48 billion by 1919. In modern terms, that single country's debt increase represents over $766 billion. The war resulted in the deaths of approximately 9 million combatants and 12 million civilians, removing those workers, most of them young, most of them in their peak productive years, from the labor forces of every nation involved. Millions more returned physically disabled, permanently reducing productive capacity. The physical destruction in northern France, Belgium, Poland alone required more than a decade of intensive, state-subsidized reconstruction to repair. Agricultural land was cratered, rail lines destroyed, cities reduced to rubble. The cost of rebuilding infrastructure that had taken generations to construct was not included in any wartime budget. There is no single number that captures what this cost. But every number that gets close to it is so large that it forces a single conclusion. No nation that entered this war came out financially intact. The war didn't just cost money. It destroyed the political structures of the nations that couldn't afford it. 4 empires that had stood for centuries collapsed between 1917 and 1918, brought down partly by military defeat and entirely by economic exhaustion. In Russia, the Tsarist regime financed the war almost entirely by printing paper rubles. By late 1916, cumulative inflation had reached nearly 400%, reducing the ruble's purchasing power to 30% of its pre-war level. Combined with severe food shortages in major cities, this debasement eroded every justification for the regime's authority. The February Revolution removed Tsar Nicholas II. The Bolshevik seizure of power in October completed the transformation, nationalizing banks and repudiating all foreign debts. Debts European creditors would never recover. In Austria-Hungary, gold reserves declined to 21% of pre-war levels, while the currency supply rose by 1,340%. The empire dissolved in autumn 1918. Successor states inherited a currency so devalued it required a League of Nations stabilization loan of 650 million gold kronen just to establish a new central bank. In Germany, the national debt rose from 5 billion marks in 1914 to 156 billion marks in 1918, while the government covered only 8% of expenditures through direct taxation. Strikes, riots, and military mutinies culminated in the German Revolution, the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II, and the birth of the Weimar Republic, inheriting a debt-ridden, blockade-starved economy and a population primed by 4 years of austerity to distrust every institution that had put them through it. The armistice was signed on November 11, 1918. The economic consequences did not sign anything. The central dispute of the interwar period was reparations. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was assigned sole responsibility for the war and required to pay financial restitution. In May 1921, the Inter-Allied Reparation Commission set the final bill at 132 billion gold marks, approximately $33 billion at the time, or roughly 600 billion in 2026 values. When Germany defaulted on a timber shipment in January 1923, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr Valley to extract payment in kind. The German government funded passive resistance by printing paper marks that triggered the hyperinflation of 1923. The mark became valueless. Middle-class savings were annihilated overnight. The United States intervened with the Dawes Plan in 1924, restructuring German payments and providing a $200 million stabilization loan. It created a circular flow fragile by design. American banks lent to Germany, Germany paid reparations to Britain and France. The Allies used those receipts to service their war debts to the US Treasury. Every link in that chain depended on continued American lending. When the Great Depression arrived in 1929 and American banks stopped lending internationally, the system collapsed. European nations suspended payments. At the Lausanne Conference in 1932, Allied powers canceled German reparations altogether, after Germany had paid fewer than 21 billion marks. Britain and France defaulted on their outstanding war debts to the United States and never resumed payment. The hyperinflationary trauma, the reparations resentment, the decade of instability, the obliterated savings, these were not background conditions to the rise of political extremism. They were the mechanism. The economic bill for the First World War, left unpaid and unresolved, created the conditions for the Second. So here is what actually happened. The optimistic scenario, the one every government sold to its citizens in 1914, assumed a short war, stable currencies, manageable debt, and a victorious peace that would cover the cost through reparations or territorial gains. In that scenario, the math worked. Barely. But it worked. The realistic scenario lasted 4 years. Destroyed 4 empires, killed 21 million people, generated $6.1 trillion in direct expenditures in modern terms, and ended not with a settled peace but with a deferred reckoning that arrived with even greater violence in 1939. The gap between those two scenarios was measured in generations of debt, in currencies made worthless, in savings accounts wiped out overnight, and in the political space that economic desperation creates for leaders who promise simple answers to complicated collapses. World War I was not only fought with bullets and soldiers. It was fought with factories, banks, taxes, debt, and entire national economies. And in many ways, the bill for that war was still being paid decades later, in forms that no government in 1914 had ever put on a budget line. The next time someone tells you a war will be short and self-financing, remember what that assumption cost the last time someone believed it.